So I just want to kind of go through the reason why we're making this gap 2 3/4. That's this gap right here. So just a little bit of theory on what's happening here. Essentially, our gap in our template is 2 3/4 inches. Our brass bushing is 3/4 inches, and our straight bit is a half. So 3/4 of an inch minus a half is a quarter. 2 3/4 minus a quarter is 2 1/2. So if you remember, we cut our leg to 3 inches across. So our template will notch out 2 1/2 inches. Then we rabbet 1/2 inch. That gives us 3 inches wide. This width is determined by the template, but the depth is determined by the plunge on the router. So to determine that, we take the width of our leg, in this case it's 2 inches. We know our dado is going to be 1/2 inch, so we go 2 minus a half is 1 1/2. So in this case, we are going to set our plunge depth to 1 1/2. We'll go over that when we actually make the Maloof joint. Okay, so in the last video, we worked on building this template. So one of the things I did is I put this in my bench vise, and I actually routed out this piece here. So what I did is I took my brass bushing of 3/4 inches, my 1/2 inch straight bit, and I used it on here and just cut out this notch. So the next step is taking this template and tracing the notch onto the top. What that's going to do is allow us to cut out a rough shape on the bandsaw. We don't cut it out to the exact size, we cut it smaller, but it's just less work for the router. So basically we set this on here, trace it out, make a little square there, and we're left with this. So we're going to do that on all 4 corners. So what I'm trying to do at this point is I'm trying to figure out how deep of a notch I need to cut. So the depth is determined by the width of the, the thickness of the leg. So I actually have 1 15/16. I had a little bit of a rough edge on some of these legs, so I decided to get rid of it. So I'm not exactly 2, I'm 1 15/16. The rabbet around the Maloof joint is 1/2 inch. So I have to subtract 1 15/16 minus a half. So that leaves me with 1 7/16. So that's the depth I need to plunge. So I need 1 7/16 plunge depth, but you have to incorporate the thickness of the top into that. So what I usually do is I will just take my template, I will clamp it on just lightly, just to keep it in place. So essentially that allows me to move this up and down, get my measurement, and everything stays in place. So what I'm trying to do is I got to take 1 7/16, but I also need to add the thickness of this top. Now the boards are 3/8, but I don't think birch ever really comes out exactly as it should, so I'm not just going to subtract or add 3/8, I'm going to physically measure it. So what I do is I'm basically just going to plunge this down. Hopefully you can see here. It's going to plunge it down to 1 7/16. So right about there. I just lock it in. Take this guy off. At this point, I will just set my depth using the using the depth plunge here. Set it up. There we go. I'll lock it in. Now we're good to go. So now we can just basically plunge and keep repeating that same depth. Okay, so we're at the point right now where we have the top clamped into a vise. Our template sits right on the corner. And what we do is we lock it on with a couple of clamps.